Thousands of years before the United States was even a thought, this land was an endless, thriving wilderness. We're talking dense forests, soaring mountains, deserts, and endless grasslands. And millions of indigenous people had already been calling this place home for millennia. It's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking of this era as just one monolithic group. But actually, scratch that, it was a vibrant continent made up of hundreds of distinct nations. To put it into perspective, there was literally more linguistic and cultural diversity here than in all of Europe at the time. Thriving for thousands of years, completely unaware that people across the ocean were preparing to change their lives forever. This incredible diversity was totally driven by the land itself. Across the continent, different nations adapted to their specific environments. Some were hunting buffalo across the immense Great Plains, while others were building complex, settled villages right near rivers. A lot of them became highly skilled farmers, growing essential crops like corn, beans, and squash. But despite all these different lifestyles, they really shared a profound worldview. They understood nature on a deep level and saw humans as just one small piece of a much larger, interconnected puzzle. Moving on to Section 2, the European Rush, the search for wealth and trade. Well, everything changed in the late 15th century. European kingdoms were fiercely competing to discover new trade routes. They were after spices, gold, new markets, the whole shebang. And this fierce competition is exactly what brought Christopher Columbus to the Caribbean in 1492, which basically opened the floodgates. It was a race, plain and simple, but everyone ran in totally different directions. Spain had its south, completely obsessed with finding gold. France, they looked north, prioritizing lucrative fur trade relationships with indigenous communities. And meanwhile, England dug its heels into the eastern coast, absolutely determined to build permanent, lasting colonies. And it's wild, because even within just the English colonies, the motivations were night and day. On one hand, you've got Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607. These guys were driven purely by wealth. After barely surviving some horrific starvation and disease, they basically hit the jackpot with tobacco. Tobacco was essentially the 17th century equivalent of a tech unicorn. On the other hand, Plymouth in 1620 was a totally different story, driven by faith. The settlers arriving on the Mayflower weren't looking to get rich, they wanted religious freedom. They actually built an agreement to govern themselves through shared responsibility. Over the next century or so, these settlements expanded, trade boomed, and 13 distinct British colonies stretched right along the coast.
Section 3. Rebellion and Independence. Breaking away from the crown.
So even though these 13 colonies officially belonged to Britain, they'd really started to develop their own unique identity. And the escalation toward rebellion? It was fast. It kicked off with an incredibly expensive British war with France. To pay off this massive mountain of war debt, Britain slapped new taxes on literally everything, from paper to tea. For the colonists, who had absolutely zero voice in the British Parliament, this wasn't just hitting their wallets, it was a fundamental insult to their liberty. And that anger famously boiled over in the 1773 Boston Tea Party, where protesters dramatically dumped hundreds of chests of tea right into the harbor. A massive turning point for sure. Britain tried to clamp down with strict punishments, hoping to force obedience, but no way. It completely backfired. It actually united the colonies. By 1775, the powder keg ignited, and armed conflict was unavoidable. Suddenly, you have ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, turning into soldiers. George Washington takes command of this ragtag Continental Army. They had almost no money, barely any training, and terrible supplies, and they were going up against the greatest military superpower on Earth. Yet, fueled by those radical ideas in the 1776 Declaration of Independence, and with some absolutely vital military assistance from France, they actually pulled it off. In 1783, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. A brand new nation was born. Which brings us to Section 4, Forging a New Government. Laws, not kings. Winning independence was an incredible feat, absolutely, but it was really only step one. The young nation now faced this massive hurdle. How do you unite 13 incredibly different states? They desperately needed a stable framework that wouldn't just replace a British tyrant with an American one. The solution was the Constitution. By intentionally fracturing power across 3 separate branches of government, they engineered a brilliant system where no single leader could ever become a dictator. It was the ultimate failsafe. It cemented the revolutionary ideal that this country would be ruled by laws rather than kings. And in 1789, the man who led the army to victory, George Washington, became the very first president of the United States. Taking the helm of this young, totally untested country, he guided it through some immense early challenges. But honestly, His most revolutionary act wasn't winning the war. It was establishing the democratic tradition of voluntarily stepping down from power. The people fundamentally believed they were building something entirely unique in the history of the world, and they were charting completely untested waters. Let's move to our final part, Section 5, Expansion and its Tragic Cost, the Double-Edged Sword of the Frontier. As the population exploded, Americans naturally started looking toward the vast lands lying beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson pulled off what was basically the real estate deal of the millennium, the Louisiana Purchase. We're talking pennies an acre. This single transaction with France nearly doubled the geographic size of the United States pretty much overnight. To figure out exactly what they had just bought, explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were sent out to map these unknown lands, study the wildlife, and establish relations with native tribes. What their expedition revealed was the staggering, almost unbelievable scale of the continent, and this sparked a massive westward fever. The idea spread like wildfire. Thousands of people packed up their entire lives into wagon trains, braving brutal weather and treacherous mountains, all driven by the seductive promise of endless farmland and the chance to completely reinvent themselves. But to truly understand this history, we have to look at the complete picture. For Native American nations, this westward expansion was an unmitigated tragedy. As thousands of settlers poured in seeking a better life, indigenous communities were forcefully and violently pushed from the very lands their ancestors had inhabited for generations. It was a time of broken treaties. Villages were destroyed. Many tribes were relentlessly pushed farther and farther west by direct, overwhelming military force. And this brings us to a really devastating reality. As our source material points out, one of the darkest moments came during the forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee people were forcefully removed from their homes, marched across hundreds of miles under just terrible, inhumane conditions. Tragically, so many died from disease, hunger, and sheer exhaustion before they ever even reached their destination. The expansion of this country was an era of profound, heartbreaking extremes. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought, a provocative question. How do we reconcile the endless opportunities created for some with the unimaginable suffering forced upon others? It's a heavy question, I know, but grappling with it is absolutely essential if we want to process the profound dual legacy that built the American frontier. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.